Lost Private. We're in Normandy.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 21 of the We're Not Lost Private podcast. Uh, my name is Joe Mucci. I'm your host. I'm glad you're joining me. For those of you who have been following along, you know you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/. We're Not Lost Private podcast. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Amazon. You can find us on pretty much any one of your pod carriers. But I'm glad you're with us. I've been mulling this topic over for a while. Those of you who've been following along on Soch have seen the promos for it. Originally, I got approached probably at least a year ago, if not more, by Paul Woodage to come on to World War II TV and present this topic. But it just never seemed like it was ready. Like there's always, and my friends who are historians know this, there always seems like there's one more thing you can find, one more detail you can get to. And at some point you have to figure out a stopping point. But the topic is, for me, it's the D-Day fighting around Ravenoville and Marmion Farm. Um, it's such an interesting topic because it features heavily in popular World War II history at this time because of the popularity of Band of Brothers and the men that were in that company, the proliferation of photos from around that area. Not to mention the fact that it's a popular topic with airborne historians because of the nature of the groupings of individual units that took part in the fighting up there. And so as we go through this, it becomes less of a tactical examination of the battle itself and more of an examination of the units that were in the area and took part in the fighting, and then what happened with them subsequently after D-Day in terms of where'd they go to, where'd they get off to. So I hope everybody will bear with me. Some of this information will be somewhat incomplete. I found that the limitations on this were many. Some of it had to do with the fact that the regiments, the parachute infantry regiments at the time, did not really make a very detailed accounting of the actions up in that area. So it really fell upon the individual troopers to record their memories. And it took a lot of time because there were so many units involved, to go through all of the information and all the interviews that I had over the years, and not just of Company E of the 506. There, as you'll see, for those of you watching on YouTube, and I'll try and verbalize as much of it as I can for the folks that are just catching this on pods. I'll try and capture as much of that, but you'll see it and hear about it in terms of um, the difference in units, the amount of units that were in just in that small area, and then the subsequent fighting. And then, of course, my favorite part of all this is, and the folks that have been on my tours before know because we go there, the moment you open the gate and walk into the compound at Marmion, it's like being transported back in time. It has changed very, very little um, since the days in 1944. And so you're able to transport yourself back mentally, and not to mention the fact that you can do very accurate now and then photographs comparisons while you're there as well. And so I think it's one of those very special spots. It's kind of tucked out of the way, but it's still very popular because of obvious reasons. But to me, they always had a lot of mystery in it because you always heard guys talking about, well, I went through Ravenoville and I fought at Marmion, and then they kind of just took off and then met up with their units and did their actual objectives, because Marmion was not an objective and Ravenoville was not an objective. It actually fell outside of the area where the 502nd was supposed to secure the northern portion of the airhead to protect the landings at Utah. But we'll get into this. And also, we'll talk a little bit about the German forces that are on the defense. Thankfully, my friend Niels has gotten his first volume out about defending Normandy. The second one should be coming out soon as well. And in that, he'll discuss in more detail the division and the regiment that we're gonna touch on before we actually get to the American side of the action. With that said, I'm going to switch over here to share, and I'm going to bring up the PowerPoint that I'll work off of. And hopefully the folks that are just listening, I'll do a good job in terms of um, explaining everything. But I kind of named this one "Let Confusion Reign," and that's because that's really what it was. You had so many men misdropped that end up congregating in and around this area. Um, and the German responses at times are very sporadic and very uncoordinated. And it seemed like it was a bit of in the military we'd call it a flail-X, everybody kind of flailing around and kind of meeting engagements where you're just bumping into each other in small units. But in this case, the primary units that are involved are obviously the 101st Airborne, some elements of the 82nd. Later on, you'll have the 4th Infantry Division as they come ashore. And those of you who caught my "We'll Start the War from Right Here" episode um, got a little taste of that in terms of the link ups between the two forces. And of course, the Germans, it was the 709th Infantry Division, led by General Mayor Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben. Um, but from the 709th, the unit we're really interested in is the Grenadier Regiment 919 under Oberstleutnant Gunther Keil, and its 1st Battalion under Hauptmann Fink. And of that 1st Battalion, we're really interested in the 4th Company under Oberleutnant Werner. He actually commanded the troops that were in this area and would oppose those American airborne troopers. That wasn't the only area. They actually had Ravenoville Plage as well, which is the small commune right near Utah Beach. It gets confused sometimes. The two of them get confused as one another or as part of one big community. It wasn't. But they were responsible also for the coastal defense portion of that area and as far back and as the Germans were using defense in depth in this area. So he had to spread his forces out. But Marmion Farm becomes the command and control node for the 4th Company. As you can see, those folks that are looking at this on YouTube, you can see the line and block chart coming down from the 709th down to the 4th Company. To get a feel for the units, I kind of did as much of a deep dive as I could, and put some things together as we looked at the 4th Company. The 709th, a static infantry division, average age of its troopers was about 36 years old. That number is probably a little squishy now based on Neil's broadened research. But for now, I'll leave it there, and I'm sure he'll yell at me later on if it's wrong. And 2 of the battalions, the 1st and the 3rd of the 709th, were responsible for coastal defense. The 4th Company, headquartered in Ravenoville, as I said before, and partially billeted at Marmion Farm, where the command and control element was. As much as I tried to do some research about Oberleutnant Werner, I wasn't able to find much about him. I couldn't even find his first name, to tell you the truth. But I didn't have any access to the German records. Again, Niels will probably yell at me, and he's probably got better info about it. I hope he'll chime in when I release this pod. Anyway, there were about 200 troops in it, and they had several machine guns of varying types. And again, those of you who listen to the We Have Ways of Making You Talk podcast or Paul's excellent World War II TV, there's always talk about the breadth and width of the types and calibers of the weapons possessed by many of the units in the Cotentin. Many of them are captured weapons from Czech, Poles, Russians, plus indigenous German arms. So it was quite a mix and quite a challenge for logistics to keep all those supplied. The supply officers had a heck of a time of doing so, but they took advantage of what they had access to, and they had a number of 8-centimeter mortars as well. They had quite a few foreigners in the ranks, Ostfront guys, many Georgians, and you can see, those of you viewing this, you can see that trooper wasn't pictured at the upper right, did not oppose any of the forces here that we'll be discussing, is from Battalion 797, but it's an excellent portrait of a Georgian trooper in the service of the Wehrmacht, and you can see where's the Georgian patch on his sleeve. Part of the 4th Company manned strong point 12 on Utah Beach. That strong point possessed a 5 centimeter gun, and they had also several Tobruk's around the position as well. In addition, the battalion had captured a number of French light guns and prime movers. And you can see some of them pictured: a French 1937 47 millimeter anti-tank gun, the Lafley V15T, which is a prime mover, and a Renault Chenelet, the like a tankette. Those of you who have gone to Michel Dutrez's Dead Man's Corner Museum, they have a Chenelet there. All of these were in the possession of the 4th Company and the 1st Battalion. In fact, if you get a chance to see the motion picture footage from Marmion area, you'll see a number of these vehicles being moved in and around by the Americans after they were captured. The graphic here depicts on the maps where these places are located. You can see Ravenoville sits about 4.5 kilometers north of drop zone A. That was the primary drop zone for the 502nd and elements of the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, and about 11 kilometers north of drop zone C, which was the primary drop zone of the 506th, and then about 12 kilometers east-southeast of drop zone N, which was the drop zone for the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And I mentioned N because some of the 508 troopers will come into play later on. The strong point 12 sits 3.3 kilometers east-northeast of Ravenoville. So they're all roughly co-located in short distance from each other for the most part. And you can see, those of you watching this can see the graphic of the picture of strong point 12 and its notation on the map of where it was located. So most of the number 4 company is split between those two areas. This is I did an overlay. I was able to get the wartime overhead aerial photograph of the area around Ravenoville and Marmion, and because it was a smaller image, I overlaid it with a modern day Google Earth image, just so as a complete picture of the area. And you can see, if you look at way the hedgerows run and some of the roadways, not much has really changed in terms of the topography. Obviously, the town's gotten a little bit, it's probably gotten a little bit bigger, but for the most part, everything remains much as it was during the war. It sits between along the roadway that leads down to Saint-Germain-de-Verville and north to Saint-Marcoux, and heading east heads, as we spoke about, towards the beach. You can see I did some general red line markings of where some of the positions were and the fortifications were within the Marmion farm complex area, and then up north, the coming out of the town, heading east towards the beach. And that'll come into play later on when we start talking about some of the units that advance into town. I do want to set the stage and talk about why we had such a plethora of different units landing in the area. And a lot of that has to do with the Pathfinders efforts. And leading the 502nd Pathfinders up north, as many of you know, is Frank Lilleman. They were to mark for DZA, just west of Saint Martin de Verville. What you'll notice is once the signaling starts, they start not only getting 502nd and 377th jumpers in their area, but they also get troopers from the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 506th. And that'll be readily displayed in the next few slides. But I did want to put in there showing at 0025, and this comes directly from Lilleman's after action, they had 7 lights and 3 Eurekas up, and they had assembled the 2 lieutenants, McCarter and Smith, and 14 enlisted men. From Lilleman, he wrote, Lieutenant McCarter was put in charge of the Eurekas and established all 3 in trees in the hedgerow adjoining the church, and he gives a grid coordinate. The T lights were installed approximately 200 yards east of this position. 1 Eureka was turned on at 0030 hours. First reception was received at approximately 0045. Lights were turned on again at 0040, and the first aircraft flew over the T at approximately 0057 hours. Groups were scattered and flying fast, with the majority of the ships dropping parachutes west and north of the position. Some parachutists were dropped east and some south of the T. Now, Lillyman's after action gives you the general impression of the scattered nature of the drops. And he basically says they're dropped to the 4 points of the compass from where we had set up the markings. So this should tell you you're going to have a number of sticks coming in. And as we discussed, a lot of the troopers that fall in this area are 506 troopers who their aircraft, their lead aircrafts lock on to the Eureka beacon using their Rebecca receivers on the aircraft, and they home in on that. And that's why you have a number of 506ers dropping in that area. Now, this graphic kind of gives you a good look at the chaos of the drop when you think about it. Now, I pieced together the flight paths based on what the men who landed told me. Because of the chaotic nature of the flight paths coming in, because of the cloud banks, and because of the incoming fire, obviously many of the formations broke up. Now, I got to give the pilots a lot of credit. They managed to keep their aircraft on some semblance of a flight path, find their beacons, and then make their way over to them and conduct their drops. Now, the folks that are watching this on YouTube can see the different units here. Starting from the north, you have Fox Company of the 502nd cutting south to north, and second stick carrying second platoon A Company 506. And I want to give a shout out to Philip Russo for his outstanding help in piecing together a lot of the A Company stuff, and of course Don Burgett's seminal work, Currahee, in piecing together actions on the ground. But you also see a stick from A battery of the 377th dropping in north of the town, and then east of the town, another second platoon of A Company 506 stick carrying Don Burgett, a number of the men that were in his platoon. You also have what I think is 3 sticks of C Company of the 506 dropping west to east, just south of the town. Another stick from second platoon of D Company lands down in Bondeville or Baudenville, depending on what era you're talking about of that little town. You also have a stick from third platoon of E Company of the 506th, a stick from the second platoon of C Company of the 502nd, and that one gets a lot of discussion because of Leighton Black's book, The Last First Sergeant. My friend Judy has done a lot of research about it. Her dad, Bob Cahoon, was a member of that platoon, and he wrote about his experiences. Some of that will come into play. They also had from D Battery of the 377th overflies close to Marmion Farm before conducting its drop, and then finally you have a stick from B Company of the 502nd, and then a 3rd Battalion headquarters 502 stick that drops just west of the farm. So again, those of you who are looking at this on YouTube can see how chaotic it must have been as those aircraft came over the area, and the mingling of flight paths. I did as best I could to make this as least cluttered as I could, but it's to show the chaos and the nature of the drops. I felt there was value in showing each one of these sticks together on the map before going through them individually. Now, I will preface this by saying, as we go through this, there's a lot of these actions likely happened at close to the same time. I'm going to have to present it in a linear fashion where I talk about it as if they were happening sequentially. Not that's and it's unlikely that happened. Many of these are probably occurring around the same time. So I ask you to bear with me as we go through these. The first one I wanted to look at was the 2 sticks from the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. The A battery one that landed up north of town, and then the D battery one that landed south of the farm. Men like Culpepper in Stick 77, you had Captain Aldrich, Marshall, Garsh, Beneke, and the A Battery First Sergeant Harold Bloor, who I believe gets battlefield commission, I want to say after Bastogne. But anyway, Ed Beneke was a prolific photographer. It took many photographs, including some of the ones we saw around the town. Culpepper, Lieutenant Culpepper, I believe, gets captured and he's held in the German command post in Marmion, and he's able during the fighting to free himself using the little hacksaw blade that was in his escape kit that the Germans failed to find when they captured him. But these two sticks jump, and again, the Culpeper story is a very interesting one. But these men end up landing in this area. And I added that third picture. For those of you familiar with the photographs shot by Easy Company's Forrest Guth, this trooper appears in one of the photos with Floyd Talbert and Forrest, and he's a 377th PFAB guy. So it's likely because of where the 3rd Platoon E Company guys landed, he's likely part of that D Company, D battery stick that Culpeper jumped from 77. Although we're never able to identify him, and even though he has his name tape on his uniform, and I have a high resolution version of the picture, he could never decipher what his name was. But it was interesting to see him. The first time I ever saw that photograph has got to be almost 20 years ago, when Forrest first showed him to me, and I always wondered who he was. And he's like many things that, many pieces of, we'll call them evidence that have come out of the war. We'll never know who it was or what it was, or in his case, who it was. To me, those enduring mysteries help fuel people's research. Somebody might grab onto that and say, well, you know what? If we know it's stick 77, stick 77 from 377, maybe we can keep doing some digging. But I've tried and I've gotten nothing but crickets when I've looked for it or asked friends about it. So it's one of those mysteries. The next stick we're going to look at is the one from 2nd Platoon of C Company, the 502nd. Again, a lot of this information, I got to credit Judy for digging up, and then, of course, Leighton Black's book. Now, there's been some discussion recently about the flight path and landing of these troopers and where we think they were. To me, based on the information gathered, I think they landed somewhere south of the farm complex, based on the descriptions of what happened. Now, originally, when I first looked at the information, I always thought it was they were actually north of the farm complex in that large field above, but below the town. But once I started to go back and read about the actions there, like from Edwin Funk and Charles Hickson, these guys were part of those actions. But you also had, it was the 2nd Squad's machine gun section. You had a number of men. These were all highlighted in Leighton Black's book, for those of you that had it. And then also remember this company, this platoon, the 1st Squad, is James Flanagan, who's obviously the center point of that famous photo that's taken, that seems to come out every D-Day and get dusted off, and is still some of the troopers in that. There's still arguments to this day or about who's who in the zoo. But I believe that this stick came in south of the farm. Moving on to the 3rd Battalion headquarters, 502nd stick. This one's probably more well known because Major John Stopka, who is the XO of 3rd Battalion headquarters, a very well-known and tragic figure because he's ended up getting killed by friendly fire in the Battle of the Bulge. This story is more well known because one of his troopers, Lieutenant Ernest Harris, is eventually decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross for leading an attack into the farm, towards the farm complex, and helping to clear it. But Stopka takes on almost this mythical role in the current history of this fight, because he becomes known as the Mad Major, or the Mad Major of Marmion, depending on whose account you read. But he really takes control of the situation there. He grabs all these paratroopers. He starts to get them positioned because they know the Germans will try and push towards the beach, and he's well aware of that because he knows his battalion's responsibility is to get to causeway number 3 and hold it open to assist the 4th Infantry Division coming off the beach. So Stopka is well aware of the importance of holding this position, especially because if you've been to Marmion, and even if you haven't, you can see the map. Once you come out of the farm complex and move southwest along that small road, you get to a crossroads, and that crossroads can control traffic north to south and west to east. Um, so he's aware of the significance of the terrain. So he uses his knowledge of the situation and what needs to be done to help position forces in the area and hold this area open. And again, he becomes almost this mythical character. And because nobody is able to speak to him because he's killed later in the war, we never get to know what his thought process is during that time. Um, so it's pretty interesting how um, his the memory of him and the knowledge of him becomes, it takes almost like this mythic and heroic stature, and which is probably well deserved based on what he accomplished. And the next stick we're going to look at is the B502 one. Now this one, for those of you looking at this, you see the question mark. I had a hard time positioning where this stick came across. The only one that I ever read any account of was from Tony Lujan from the third platoon of B Company, and he talked about it in fighting in the area in very general terms. But we do know there's other members of B Company that landed in the area from his stick, because they're some of the ones that appear in this in that very famous photograph. And those of you watching this on YouTube, you can see it. Justice, Baker, Newinger, Fuller, Ridgway, um, all these men, and I've numbered them so you can, pick out who's who, um, all end up at Marmion. So to me, um, this is one of those mysteries we'll never get any more information on. Again, Tony never talked about his exact landing. And again, remember when these guys jumped, it was dark, took time for them for the units to coalesce. And by the time it was daylight, you were probably moving. You might not even known what town you were in. Um, he may have Tony may have looked and seen like the town sign or something, because as we see when we'll get to one of the the subsequent slides, there's a very famous photo that Ed Beneke took that shows the sign leading west to east into the area where that intersection is that I talked about outside the farm complex. So it's quite possible that he spotted that sign so he knew where he was, or maybe somebody told him what town they were fighting in. A Company of the 506, and this is one of those ones that we know more about than the others because the guys that survived wrote extensively, and this is underpinned by Don Brigitte's fantastic work in Currahee, where he records a lot of his early um, his memories from the jump and landing. And we know that Don Brinnenstuhl, who was a private or a PFC at the time, along with William Muir, who was the lieutenant, their one of their platoon leaders, end up leading the assault back into town. You'll see where number 2 is, where Don comes in from the east. They land east of the town, and they end up having a couple of brisk firefights. They ended up having a couple of guys captured as well. And they make their way into town, again, having a couple of gunfights. Then they cut south. They cut from they come in from the east, but before they reach the center of the town or even the major outskirts of the town, they cut across 2 fields, and those 2 fields bring them up to the main roadway leading south, and they parallel that roadway down to Marmion Farm, where they end up taking part in the defense. And I remember touring with Paul Woodage and Don Brigitte back in 2012, and we stood there with Don as he explained where he took up position once they got outside the farm. Now, if you've been there, there's a little small house that sits at the corner where all the power lines come in for the community, for the town. And there's a little gully that runs along that. And Don took up position in there with Justo Correa, another guy from his platoon. And what they did was, because they had to secure that roadway because they were worried about the Germans driving tanks in, even though We know they only have a few Renaults in this area and Chenelets, some small stuff that doesn't really have a lot of fiber, certainly not any Tigers or Panthers. But they decide to mine the roadway with Hawkins mines. And Hawkins mines, for those who are unfamiliar, they look like a can of paint thinner with a fuse assembly welded to the side of it. And the idea behind it is you'd use it to break, you put it as a mine in the street or on the road where a tank could roll over it. It would break the igniter assembly and it would ignite the mine, blow the tread off the tank, and then you could swarm the tank and take it out. Well, Justo and Don go out in the street and they place their Hawkins mines, and then they hustle back over to the gully. And then when they do that, they were looking at each other, and Don's like, "We can't just leave them out there; they'll spot them for sure." So they go out to the field and they get across from them and they get a couple of cow pies and they walk back out in the middle of the street and they dump these cow pies on top of the mine, so it looks like a cow had relieved itself in the middle of the road instead of just these two mines sitting out there. But anyway, you can see also elements of Don's squad take part in some fighting near the church. Those of you who have been on tour with me know the story about Hagenbach fighting near the church, and he's later killed down near Dead Man's Corner. And then Don told us a story about how they had retrieved a airborne cart loaded with mortar ammunition, and at some point they didn't know what to do with it, so they buried it in Don's words in a field. Um, but nobody has ever been able to find where that cart ended up, and Don couldn't recall um, where he um, where he buried it. So Don took that story to the grave, but Paul and I wondered like what would be the dollar value of digging that crate that cart up when we were standing there talking to Don about it. But anyway, the other stick from A Company from Second Platoon was Sergeant Ted Vetlin's stick, and they land north of the town. Now, again, I'm not so sure. I don't know the timing of these again because no one of them looked at their watches and said, at 01:30 hours, I was, tooling south through the middle of Ravenoville. They just said I passed through the town, so it's a matter of trying to stagger when these guys arrived and when they didn't. And the difference between Vetlin's gang and he gathered up quite a few guys with him. Um, he said, he was carrying 10 mortar rounds in his leg bag, and he gathered up as many guys as he could. Um, and based on my research, there were 23 men of A Company, at least that I've been able to identify, that were fighting in and around the town. But um, Vetlin took his guys and moved south with them, seemingly went right through town, right past Marmion, and kept heading south because obviously the 1st Battalion of the 506, their D-Day objective was Causeway number 1. So Ted knew he had to take off and get down there. Um, so I don't know what the sequencing is when he arrived and moved past. It might have been well after um, daylight and the majority of the fighting, or at least the first round of fighting around the farm itself, had taken place, where it was permissive enough for him to take his men and keep going south, which I would find funny though, because you would think there's a group of A Company guys, they come tooling down the roadway. There's another group of A Company guys in the area. Nobody spots anybody they know. Nobody says, hey, we need to get going. We've got places to be and things to do. But there's some interesting stories that go with that. And I encourage everybody to, if you haven't already, please go and get a copy of Currahee. You will enjoy reading about it. And Don writes about this in details. Although I will say this, there was one man who was ended up being captured. And I want to say it was oh, I can't remember. I think it's Destasi. It might have been Gaddy or Destasi. He ends up being captured, but the family contacted Don because they had a conflicting report from him about how he was captured and what happened subsequently. And I don't think Don had that before he produced Currahee. And if he did, I feel certain he would have included it, the story. But still, it's a very engaging read. And Don was a very talented writer, and to be able to stand on those grounds and talk to him about those actions was a treat for sure. And I have to really thank Paul Clifford and Renee, Don's daughter, for getting Don out there for one last go around on the battlefields, because I definitely loved my time with him, and especially because there was some private moments between he and I talking about um, a friend of his that he served with that I ended up corresponding with. Just a treat to be there and be able to do that. And obviously, those times like that are gone these days because all of the vets are gone, uh, especially the ones I knew quite well. And so I always look back on those instances fondly. But moving on to the next stick, the next two sticks from third platoon of C Company of the 506. So if you're following along, you notice there's a pattern here. There's a number of 506 sticks in here. There are a number of 50 deuce ones in here. 377th. Now you're beginning to see that the amount of people that are dropping in this small area, and you're seeing the mishmash of units that are dropping in this area. And this is one of the harder ones. Well, not harder, but later accounts to rectify with the fighting around town. And really, some of it came from Al Hassanzal. Al was such a dynamite guy. I enjoyed corresponding with him, uh, and to hear his um, accounts of this early fighting right after landing, and his and Phil Russell as well. And Phil Russell um, was very dynamic in his memories about landings. And for those of you watching on YouTube, you can see that the flight pattern where they carried, and I was able to kind of pinpoint where I believe that all the men landed from those two different sticks, and they're numbered to match. So you see Al's stick is the more northerly one of the two, with Al landing to the west. That compound near the, let's see if anybody can see this. Moving the cursor around for those of you who are watching, there's a it's the churchyard. And um, Harold Miller, who was on Al's stick, Al himself, and Phil Russell all spoke about landing near the church compound, church courtyard, and then moving around it to get into town to take part in the fighting. And then you also have Bill Pine's stick with Bill Knight and Pappy Zaltz and Eddie Yost, and they land south of the church compound in those fields. And anyone who's been in that area knows the density of the orchards there. So you could see, and if you're looking at the image, you can see the way the hedgerows run in that area. You could very well be one field over from the guy that you jumped next to in your plane and not know he's there. Um, they're so isolated in nature, but they were all able to coalesce and get together and move out. And Walter Dargis was one of the other men that jumped as well. Although I don't know which of the sticks he was with, we do know that he landed near Ravenoville and ended up taking part in the fighting there before moving out to their own their own objective. But again, here's is another unit. It's another unit from 1st Battalion of the 506 jumping in this area. It's like this Ravenoville becomes this coalescent point for the airborne troopers, and even though they might be misdropped, what it does is allow them to get their bearings once they are able to reduce the German presence there. They're able to kind of get their bearings and understand where they are because of all the preparatory work they did before the jump. The sand tables, the maps, the aerial photography, they all were able from memory to be able to know where they were. Once they established where they were, they've got that benchmark point. They're able to plot how they're going to get to where they need to be. But again, just another unit of the 506 jumping in an area in the 502nd's drop zone. Now this one's a little bit more well known because of popular history, because of Spears and his time with Easy Company, but he ends up dropping in near Bandonville with his stick, which included Art Jumbo DiMarzio and Floyd Corrington. Um, and they really buzzed through town quickly based on what Art was able to tell me about this. Um, Spears in his writings, he didn't really remember a lot of this stuff. Interestingly, when he was approached about by Winters about taking part in Band of Brothers, he told Winters, he goes, guys would call me up and say, "Do you remember me?" And he would say, "What war?" Because he was involved in World War II, Korea, and later Vietnam. So um, he had a lot of, I don't know if he had selective memory loss because of the nature of the memories, or if he was truly just, couldn't remember due to age or what have you. But he ends up coming down that road that leads towards the intersection where Marmion is, with DiMarzio and Corrington and a number of other troopers from his platoon, and they end up hanging a right and heading straight down towards Causeway number 2, which was obviously the 2nd Battalion was responsible for keeping Causeway number 2 open to get the 4th help get the 4th off the beach. So I thought it was interesting. It was only briefly mentioned, but again, here's another unit, another 506 unit, this time a 2nd Battalion one, that lands well southwest of the town, comes in, doesn't even get into the town proper, gets to the intersection near where the farm is, makes the right, and then heads south immediately, heading for their D-Day objective. Then I know this is one that a lot of you have been waiting for. Easy Company, their 3rd platoon releases over in this area. Their flight path takes them southwest of the farm. And I believe this is where a number of those pictures are taken with the farmers um, that everybody seems to know. But of the men that we were able to identify of landing and then fighting in and around Marmion, you have Floyd Talbert, Forrest Guth, Walter Gordon, Campbell T. Smith, Frankie Mellett, Ed Tipper, John Lee Eubanks, and Daniel Boone West. I know my friend Kathy's probably smiling as we talk about her dad. Um, these guys were all in some way, shape, or form either photographically cataloged as being in the area or cataloged by accounts from the other men. And you can see the ones that I have labeled there. Um, and obviously, Forrest and Walter using Forrest. It's not Forrest's camera, it's actually Rod Stroll's camera that Forrest carried. Um, they swap out taking pictures in the area. There's a whole lot of them taken. Now, really, what's interesting about the E Company role there is they actually stay a bit longer than they should have. Instead of heading off down south towards Causeway number 2, they actually stay with the 502 and help defend Marmion Farm. And Ed Tipper, I hat tip to Marcus Brotherton for his interviews with Ed and my own interviews with Ed. He talked extensively about fighting at Marmion and how they had to position shooters up on top of the roofs of the farmhouses, which I find a little bit difficult to understand because if you've been there, you understand the angle of those roofs does not make for easy positioning to fire. But there are firing ports all over those buildings that could be used. But Ed talks about having to defend the farm complex against numerous attacks from the Germans. And it's really interesting reading. So if you haven't caught up with Marcus's books, and especially the ones where he's um, We Who Are Alive and Remain, where he interviews Ed and Ed talks about the fighting around Marmion. It's very engaging. And when you take that and you overlay it with Don's book, you get a real good feel about the fighting in and around that town. And little groups of paratroopers, or as they would say nowadays, little groups of pissed off paratroopers gathering together, and then they go out and they fight, and then they move out to their objectives, all the while causing all kinds of havoc. And their ability to help in the defense of that farmhouse, like I talked about with when I was speaking about Stopka and him understanding the importance of that position and holding that open. Um, you understand the Germans knew the importance of that as well. When you read about Ed's account where he talks about multiple attacks, but what he did say was they never masked their efforts. It was always sporadic in how they made their attacks. They never masked their troops to bull their way through the paratroopers' defenses. It was more of think about the accounts about the fighting around the Bastogne perimeter, right? One of the criticisms of the Germans was they never massed their forces and tried to punch through in one singular place to force a gap in the perimeter where they could exploit it. Um, they would simply just attack all around the perimeter, allowing the Americans to defend themselves well, because the if you're in the defense, you're at an advantage over your attacker. Well, the same applies here. But in this case, the importance of that position becomes much more relevant when you read those firsthand accounts where the men talk about how difficult it was and how many attacks take place that they have to defend against. Now we also have a stick from F Company to the 502nd. So not only do you have 3rd Battalion 502nd stick just dropping in the area, but you have F Company 502nd ones. One dropping in the area. Stick number 9 carrying Legrand Legs Johnson. He gathers up Nick Schultz and a squad of men, and he said they landed well north of DZA. And have to thank George Koskamaki, Coach K, for all of his interviews. We have Johnson's accounting of this action, but he said he gets to Ravenoville around 0430 hours, which tells you it's not even light out by the time that Johnson and Schultz get there and start moving through, and they just keep going because they know that this is not their objective. So, and I'm not even sure if they end up seeing or talking to anyone. They should have, considering when some of the other troopers landed. They may have just come through town, seen a number of the other troopers in the area in the defense, knowing that they had to be at St. Martin de Verreville, which was their objective. Johnson keeps them moving. They go right through town. So there's not a really good accounting of their fighting, but there is a good accounting of how they just said, all right, we've got to be somewhere else. Unlike the 3rd Platoon Easy Company guys who helped defend Marmion Farm, Johnson and his guys head out right for their objective. And he's a company commander, he's a captain. So he understands more than, say, a private, how important it is for them to get to their objective area. And then I think this is the last unit we end up covering. It's an element of the 508th. Remember, I talked about drop zone N all the way to the west past Saint-Marie-Église. These guys end up dropping somewhere in this area. It's unknown. I believe it's well north, and they end up making their way south. And there's photographic evidence of these, the 508 troopers. And as far as I could tell, the majority of them came from service company and regimental headquarters of 508th. For those of you who are able to access it, Worcester Morgan, he was a staff sergeant in the regimental S2. He wrote about his D-Day actions. And they're out there. You can do a simple search, a name search for him if you're interested in reading about it. But I always thought it was interesting because the photographic evidence of these guys lounging inside the town, and not knowing really where they needed to be based on what how they don't seem to be moving with much purpose to get west to where they belong. But for those of you looking at this on YouTube, you can see a list of some of the men that were definitely in the group from the 508th that ended up in the town beforehand. Now, again, we talked about the defense of the town, some of the captured equipment. According to Ed Tipper, every 60 minutes or so, they were subjected to a German attack, and it came from multiple directions. So it wasn't like the paratroopers had pushed out defenses all the way around at great distance. They used the complex as the center point of their defense, and they had some positions out and about in the area, but it wasn't like they had a ton of troopers to work with. So you had to keep your supporting elements close to each other so they could support each other. When you don't have a lot of troops, you're going to have to tighten up your perimeter, and that's exactly what Stopka ends up doing. Um, According to Tip, also, almost as soon as they seized the complex, they were subjected to counterattacks. And again, I talked about this before. The Germans never concentrate their attacks in order to punch through in a single point for where they could exploit and then fan out once they're inside that inner perimeter of the defense. They never do that. They kind of hit multiple spots at one time. It doesn't allow them to mass their combat power, and it lets the GIs repel the attacks. And finally, later that day at 12 o'clock, the 8th Infantry Regiment end up arriving. I covered this in my We'll Start the War from Right Here pod. I highly recommend, if you're interested in hearing about the accounts of the infantry linking up with the paratroopers, go back and check that one out. It's a fave. I really love it. There was a lot of research that went into that thing. I apologize for some of it not being as smooth and clean as I would like. I will only use my exuberance in my defense in terms of my desire to present the information, and you kind of get excited and you start talking about something, and sometimes you get a bit off track. But the 8th Infantry comes in from the east after coming off the causeways, um, and it finally relieves the paratroopers, and they're able to head back. All these guys, these groups of paratroopers are able to finally break loose and head towards their actual objectives are and link up with their parent units. Whereas the 8th, um, again, I think I talked about this quite a bit in my other pod, but you have to feel for the 4th Infantry Division. And while they had an easier go of it coming ashore at Utah, um, their subsequent fighting for them is truly horrific. I recommend reading books like Clay Pigeons of San Lo, to really get a good understanding of some of the stuff that they had to deal with, unless you want to go and read their actual unit journals, which you can find. To me, they end up suffering later on in truly horrible ways. The Germans do a terrific job in defending, especially in the San Lo area. Um, and so I highly recommend, if you're interested in the topic of what happens after D-Day and the subsequent fighting in the Normandy campaign, please do some reading. There's so much more than just D-Day out there. I know it holds everybody's imagination because of again, and I've exposed some of it in this, the unknown nature of what was happening um, during those few hours, those opening hours. Um, and now with almost all the men gone, there's never going to be any more first person accounts than what we have. And some of those accounts may still be undiscovered. They may be out there. And I think a number of the ones that I discovered in looking for information and material for this podcast and the previous one on the 4th, it's still out there, but you got to look for it. The good thing is a lot more of it's becoming digitized. It's becoming much more accessible. There's less of a requirement for historians to go physically to an archives, although I'll never tell a historian never to go to an archive because there's so much more there that has not been digitized. But if you're truly interested in the topic, you can find plenty of information out there, and you should definitely um, try and get there if that's what you truly want to do in terms of research and learning more about these men. And lastly, I'll just revisit Confusion Reigns. Um, I absolutely love The Last First Sergeant by Leighton Black. Great book. He talks about the men in such a great manner, a lovingly manner. He obviously, felt a tremendous respect and loyalty and love for the guys he served with, but there were quite a few mistakes in his book, as my friend Judy had found out early on with her dad being a member of the same unit. Um, if you look at the graphic there, and for those of you who are listening on the pod, I apologize you can't see this, but this is a hand-drawn map from Leighton Black that was passed around to members of his unit, and it doesn't match up. It doesn't match up at all. And when you try and overlay it to where you think it belongs, um, you can't match it at all. So it's very hard to rectify this with the accounts that you end up reading. It's, there's um, the main points that you would use for reference to align the hand-drawn map against an actual map just don't exist. They just don't match up at all, and it makes it very difficult to like I said, to rectify it. So it's not just the confusion that happened on D-Day itself, but it's the subsequent accounting of it. Many of the men only mentioned it in passing, and you had to find, hopefully, multiple stick members in order to tie together uh, some semblance of an account of where these guys landed and then where they fought. So I apologize if it feels like there's not as much detail as folks would want. Um, it was definitely a struggle to put it all together, but at the very least, you could get an appreciation of all the different units that landed in this area, and some of them stayed and fought, and some of them said, "This is not my objective," and they took off to go get to their objectives. And I just thought it was interesting how so many of them overlap in this one small area. Um, and it's always a joy to be in that area when you walk around and see the hedgerows. They're much smaller now than they used to be, but you see the fields and you see the hedgerows, and you see the community is largely unchanged, and you kind of look at it and you can kind of see in your mind's eye groups of paratroopers moving to and from places, or taking up positions. And I know when I was there with Don and we were talking about the cow pies and the Hawkins mines, I could see in my mind's eye this skinny little, I think Don was what, 19 at the time. He was very young, hustling out in the middle of this roadway and dropping this mine up, and then going up and scooping up a cow pie and dropping on it. Yeah, yeah. It's one of those areas where your suspension of belief can really help you understand the importance of this area. But it doesn't get nearly the recognition that, say, Salmir Iglesias does, because this wasn't featured in the longest day, and even though the 508th was in the area, you don't really have the overlap of both units where both the 82nd and the 101st can claim an equal share, kind of like St. Mare, where there are several 101st sticks that drop in there and help secure that town. Um, there's really probably only one stick of 508 guys who end up in the area. So it doesn't have that name recognition. It doesn't have that fanfare attached to it. But to me, it's one of those important places because there's so much going on in such a small area. But anyway, I hope everybody enjoyed this. If you're following me on YouTube, please like and subscribe and share this. If you're following me on any of the other pods, please, same thing, like and share. Pass it off to your friends. If you want to become a Patreon supporter, it's a measly $3 a month. I post up all kinds of pictures. There's some vids that I post up that are member only. I try and put up paperwork at times, and then of course my own writings about stuff. I'm working on my first volume, my Easy Company compendium called "Jump into the Fight." I'm hoping to have that out after the new year. Thanks again for everybody following. Again, we're on Patreon, patreon.com/ We're Not Lost Private Podcast. And you can follow us on socials. We're on Instagram, my personal account on Twitter X. We're on Facebook. And also, we'll be joining Blue Sky soon. So we'll have a presence on there as well. But thanks again for everybody following. I hope you enjoyed the slideshow and the talk about what I consider one of these critical spots in the early morning of D-Day for the 101st Airborne and in part the 82nd Airborne. Thanks again for following along. I'll see you soon. Bye.